our number 10 spot, we have this bullet story. This story comes from a person who is working in trauma surgery. One night they got a notification that a man had been shot 3 times in the head and was on the way in. When he gets there, he has literally one eye hanging out of its socket, blood everywhere, and he is slumped over. So it seemed that he had one bullet go in through his temple and out of his right eye socket, one bullet in the nose exited out of the roof of his mouth, and another went in his cheek and out the side of his head. The doctor goes over to examine him and is assuming he'll just be pronouncing him dead, but when he tilts the man's head back, he quickly says, "Yo, be gentle." The doctor accidentally screamed, but he was not alone, as everyone in the room was quickly shocked at the fact that this man was still alive. I guess the entry and exit wounds showed that every single bullet had missed his brain, and he ended up making it through the whole ordeal. In our number 9 spot today, we have this eyeless face story. Before I get into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. This one comes from a nurse rather than a doctor, but I feel like it definitely still applies. She was working at the home of an elderly lady who had some learning disabilities and had also had her eyes completely removed due to a condition that she had from birth. The lady was apparently super nice, but had this habit of wandering around her apartment late at night in complete silence. One night the nurse woke up and left her room at 2 a.m. to head to the bathroom when she had quite the scare. As she left her bedroom, she was met with the old lady who was silently standing in the hall as she turned her eyeless face towards the nurse. Imagine being in a dark room after you just woke up and seeing an eyeless face look at you. It honestly would be enough to frighten anyone before you realized exactly what was going on. In our number 8 spot today, we have another eye story. This story comes from someone who goes by the screen name I'm Cuttin', and they said, "I have quite a few stories. Most of them are hilarious, and then there are those you never want to think about. What messed me up the most was when I saw how eyes change at the moment of death. Imagine you are looking at clear water, but that clear water changes to foggy in an instant. In my 8 years here, I've only seen this once, and I've personally seen well over 250 dead or dying people." This is one thing that I've always thought that I can't understand how healthcare professionals do. I definitely don't think I can see people die all the time, especially not when it's like what he just described. In our number 7 spot today, we have a car accident story. This story comes from a person called Jeremy Howell, and they're recounting one of their mom's stories. Jeremy says, "A guy came in from a car accident and was losing blood. In the midst of resuscitation, the man jolts awake and screams, 'Don't let me go back there. Please, please, please don't let me go back.' A few seconds later, they lost him." What? Like, imagine. That would scare me half to death. Seriously, you guys. In our number 6 spot today, we have this dead guy moaning story. This story comes from someone who goes by the username I'll Do It Later from when they worked at a hospital. They said, "One of my duties was to help wheel patients who had expired down to the in-house morgue. Once we were wheeling an older man from the ER down the hallway when he let out this low moan. I started to panic thinking that he was coming back to life, but the registered nurse explained to me, in brackets they have newbie, that sometimes the air in the lungs doesn't come out until sometime later, or it is delayed for a bit." While I definitely feel like whoever this story is from should have definitely already known this, that would be so scary for a second when you don't know what is happening. In our number 5 spot today, we have a crying blood story. This is another story that comes from a registered nurse, but it definitely needed to be mentioned in this video. A 24-year-old man came into the ER one day with flu-like symptoms. He had some sort of rash that sadly ended up being a symptom of failing a battle with bacterial meningitis, and it was causing him to bleed internally. He was in such bad condition that he started crying, but his tears were blood. She said she could see how scared he was at his eyes, which is so sad to think about. He ended up actually passing away, and the nurse whose story this is had said that in her long nursing career, this is the one that just really stuck with her. In our number 4 spot today, we have a whole story. This story comes from someone called Pete Lancosta and is a bit of a gross one, so just a warning. Pete says it was someone who had a massive hole under his right arm, creating a cavity where you could see and hear whistling from the right lung. young. It had been worsening for maybe 10 years, so the initial injury had mostly healed. Honestly, you guys, I almost couldn't read this one out loud. I can't imagine what that would be like for all parties involved in that situation. In our number 3 spot today, we have a tumor story. This story actually ended up being published in a medical journal for how crazy it is. A 90-pound, 16-year-old girl came in one day with flu-like symptoms, a sore right side with a bit of a bump. They went to check for gallstones, but it actually turned out to be a tumor. It ended up being removed the next week, and it turned out to be a 7-pound tumor that was as big as a dinner plate. This is not normal. It was so big that it had outgrown its blood supply. That's insane and so yucky. I'm glad this one came out with such a positive outcome though. We needed more of that on this list today. In our number 2 spot today, we have this intestine story. This story starts off on a wild note from someone who is explaining one of their mom's stories. It goes, apparently one guy walked into the emergency room entrance holding his intestines in his hand, calm as can be, and shouted, "Can I get a little help, please? I think I'm gonna die." Now, this dude wasn't gutted wide open holding all of his entrails, but he had a pretty major cut to the midsection, causing some of his intestines to be protruding externally. This dude is alive, and my mom told me she had no idea how somebody could walk into an emergency room like that and be so calm. Honestly, props to everyone in this situation for remaining calm, because it undoubtedly saved that guy's life that day. In our number 1 spot today, you guys, we have this rising from the dead story. This story comes from someone who goes by Simple Simon 6262 and is honestly pretty crazy, but also kind of cool. They said, "When I was a student, I got called in on a stroke patient. She had coded and they were doing CPR. They worked for 45 minutes, but she died. They cleaned her up and called on the family to say goodbye, but by that time, the family had left. She had been both brain dead and without a pulse for more than 45 minutes. Suddenly, she sat up and called for her family. The nurses rushed to get the monitors and equipment back on her. They started working on her again, she stabilized, said goodbye to her family, and then promptly died a second time." That would be so insane to witness, but I'm also so glad that she got to say goodbye to her family. I honestly think that must be the reason she ended up coming back, even if it was just for a couple minutes.
Number 10. Hysteria. I've been waiting a long time to talk about this. Okay, so technically the treatment ended up being a good thing, but admittedly it was more the condition they lied about. As a hint to where this is going, hysteria comes from the Greek word hystera, which means uterus. By the end of the 19th century, 75% of women in America were diagnosed with hysteria. It was a term to describe a condition where an excess of emotion led to an out-of-control behavior. Symptoms included shortness of breath, anxiety, forwardness, irritability, agitation, insomnia, and even sometimes hallucinations. So, in other words, a very, very bad mood. One of the treatments used to remedy this were pelvic massages to achieve a hysterical paroxysm in order to stabilize and de-stress the patient. In today's terms, we call that an orgasm, which was something hysterical women didn't get a lot of, or women around that time in general. Pelvic massages have been performed as early as ancient Greece to cure the wandering womb, a fictitious condition where women's wombs were autonomous and would wander into their shoulder, for example, making it sore. The treatment was so popular, doctors finally thought it was time to invent a device who could do it for them. So they invented a device that vibrated in a particularly efficient way to achieve the result. The device remains very popular today, but the term hysteria has been debunked as an umbrella term to describe a multitude of actual disorders and conditions. Number 9. The placebo effect. The mind is a powerful thing. It can tell you something is really wrong, or it can lie to you, which is one of the reasons why doctors sometimes prescribe placebos. They take advantage of the power of suggestion. In a study for the journal PLOS One, out of 783 doctors, of which 71% were registered with the UK's General Medicine Council, 97% said that they had used substances or methods that lacked therapeutic value, aka they prescribed placebos. placebos. Only a tenth said that they were actually upfront about it, but half said that the therapy helped many other patients. Some placebos included vitamin C for cancer, saline injections, and sugar pills. The effectiveness of placebos, if it is a psychological issue, only works as well as the patient believes it will. But bottom line, prescribing something that you know has actually no value is unethical. One of the worst cases actually happened recently. An anti-vax German nurse gave over 8,000 people saline instead of the vaccine to give them a false sense of immunity because they just didn't believe in it. Number 8. Fen Men. Everybody wants a quick fix, but they are rarely ever real. The first diet pill hit the market in the late 1800s, and today the weight loss industry is valued at over $60 billion, with a large portion of that being mainly diet pills. The only two known appetite suppressants were fenfluramine and phentermine, but they didn't prove to be largely effective. However, one doctor, Michael Van Traub, decided to combine them and make a new miracle weight loss drug in the 1970s called fen-phen. At first it appeared to work wonders. A single study of 120 patients over 4 years, terrible study size, just saying, saw the majority of female patients lose an average of 30 pounds. There were apparently no side effects, but no one was actually studying their hearts. It was introduced in 1992 and it swept the nation. After a rough debate, the FDA approved it, but in 1996, things went bad. Almost like perfect timing. 24 women taking the pills developed serious heart problems, and soon hundreds more were reported. Because of this severe oversight, the American Home and Products Corporation, inventors of fen-phen, had to pay $3.75 billion settlement. 50,000 more settlement cases were filed. So much for a quick fix, eh? Number 7. Radium. I learned about this recently through a series of lists and I still can't believe it. Radium is a radioactive substance that we know now can cause a series of life-threatening complications after repeated exposure. But in the late 19th and early 20th century, this stuff was used for everything. From skincare to toothpaste and water, this stuff was put in everything. From as early as 1896, the effects radium had against cancer were noticed, but soon it became a cure-all for most things like diabetes, rheumatism, and even impotence. As a result, a massive radium industry in the 1920s boomed, and soon you could find it on every shelf in the pharmacy. It was even recommended to drink a glass of water with radium in it because it was good for your health. But then people started to notice some pretty serious side effects such as, I don't know, organs failing, muscle and bone deterioration. You know, all the things radioactive exposure does to a person. The period lasted for 25 years, but by the time World War II hit, the product was considered dangerous. Can I say doctors lied about it if they didn't really know the full effects of the material? Not quite, but at the same time, prescribing something they didn't quite understand doesn't sound very truthful, does it? Number 6, the starvation doctor. Got a cold? Starve yourself. Got depression? Starve yourself. Got cancer? Yeah, don't eat food. Sounds ridiculous, right? Good. Because it is. But to Linda Burfield Hazard, it was the most sensible treatment one could do. Once she gained her medical license through a loophole, Linda preached that strict fasting was the only cure for disease. In her novels Fasting for the Cure of Disease and Scientific Fasting, the Ancient and Modern Key to Health, she spread her pseudo-scientific message wherever anyone would listen. She believed that all illnesses were a result of excess eating and that you had to starve yourself for months to stave off disease. Crazy. So she created her own sanitarium where she would only allow patients to drink tomato juice, asparagus juice, and sometimes a teaspoon of orange juice. Ridiculous. Once patients were in her care, if they tried to leave, she would have them declared insane. After 40 patients died, she was finally convicted of manslaughter in 1912 and was sentenced to hard labor. But for some reason, she was pardoned after 2 years. Then she moved to New Zealand and tried to practice there, but her license was revoked because of lack of credentials. Moral of the story, if someone tells you to starve yourself, make them watch you eat a burrito and smile. Number 5, lobotomies. Of course this was going to be on the list. The miracle procedure invented by Walter Freeman. Finally, there was a way to alleviate the pain and distress of the mentally and emotionally tormented by turning them into vegetables. So not really curing it at all. Freeman was an absolute crook of a doctor, though he wasn't seen as one at the time. He developed what was known as the prefrontal lobotomy, a procedure that involved removing a section of the brain. Early versions involved drilling into the brain, but the new version involved an ice pick through the eye. He would sometimes even use the one he found in his kitchen. Delightful. Freeman's procedure left thousands of patients incapacitated, including one very famous Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of the future president. More than 15% of his patients died, one during a live broadcast. Despite this, hospitals willingly let him showcase and perform the procedure, which blows my mind. Freeman was more of a showman than he was a doctor. He drove around in a car he called the lobotomobile, and then he just performed lobotomies wherever he wanted to. Finally, in 1967, he performed his last surgery on a woman in Berkeley, California. He severed a blood vessel and she died, thus ending his deceptive brain hacking miracle. Number 4, Yasser Awad. Okay, gets crazy from here. This one happened back in 2003. When Maria Martinez was just 10 years old, she started having headaches so severe she had to isolate herself away from the light. So she went to the doctor, Yasser Awad, a pediatric neurologist. He sent her to have an EEG, and Awad came to the conclusion that she was having seizures. Though she had no convulsions, he told her that they were absent seizures, which mostly featured a person kind of mentally checking out, so every time she daydreamed she thought she was having a seizure. Very subtle, but they do exist. He prescribed her a medication called Lamictal, though after several months on the medication, her condition got worse, so he doubled the dose. Skip ahead 4 years, Martinez gets a second opinion after Awad left his practice. Finds out the whole thing was a lie and that the medication actually causes headaches. She never had seizures. Awad was doing it so he could get more money. She was one of hundreds of patients that Awad intentionally misled. Her case was the first to go on trial and shed a massive light on hospital fraud. Number 3, opioids. The opioid crisis remains one of the most devastating pharmaceutical deceptions in history. The Sackler family and their company Purdue Pharma developed a new miracle drug called Oxycontin that swept the nation. It was a revolutionary new painkiller that could help patients all over the place, and that it did. The Sackler family racked in $35 billion in sales of the drug. But there was a catch, as there always is. Oxycontin contains oxycodone, a relative to heroin, aka the dragon, which made it 2 times more powerful than morphine, but just as addictive. But Purdue launched a campaign to intentionally mislead their audience in 1996 that said that Oxycontin was safe. Their catchphrase? Oxycontin, the drug to start with and to stay with. But of course, the phrase had deadly consequences. Since 1999, 200,000 people have died due to Oxycontin overdoses. Number 2, Jayant Patel. Next up, we have the man known as Dr. Death. Jayant Patel worked in both Australia and the USA and was apparently obsessed with putting people under the knife. He lied about his knowledge and competence and would often perform unnecessary surgeries on people who weren't even his patients. His lies led to the deaths of over 87 people. He was the worst combination of arrogant and stupid. He even performed a colonoscopy backwards. How do you do that? How? Beyond the actual surgeries, he would forge the documents pre and post surgery. It took a strangely long amount of time for him to be caught, even with fellow surgeons calling him out. But finally he was sentenced to 7 years in prison, but was sadly released. I hate this, but was sadly released 3.5 years after because he had good behavior. Great. Never mind that he killed so many people. The thing that makes me the most angry about this case is that he wasn't the only one who lied. Both of the hospitals he worked at let him perform with dodgy and thin credentials, which means they share the responsibility for those deaths as well. And last but not least, number 1, trial by trachea. Though lab-grown organs are slowly becoming reality, it appears they remain too good to be true. Unless you're Paolo Macchiarini, who continues to evade criticism surrounding his artificially grown trachea treatment. In 2011, Paolo shocked the world when he performed the world's first synthetic organ transplant. He replaced the patient's trachea with a plastic tube made perfectly for him. The surgeon gained worldwide fame, so much fame that even his hospital dismissed notions that the medical miracle man wasn't up to snuff. A couple investigations discovered that the foundation for the procedure was weak and that risk analysis wasn't carried out thoroughly. Out of 9 patients, 7 of them have passed away, but the questions surrounding Paolo mostly criticizes the things that happened prior to surgery. Were the patients ill enough that they required such drastic intervention, or was Paolo too eager to gain attention? I'm endlessly appreciative of the work doctors and nurses do. They are freaking heroes. But sadly, where there are heroes, there are always villains.
Okay, a very risky surgical procedure starts off this list in at number 10. In the 1920s, a medical student named Werner Frossman wanted to see if it was possible to reach the heart through the veins or arteries without the need for traumatic surgery. He believed that he could reach the heart through a vein in the arm, so he asked his professor if he can test this theory on a patient. Obviously, for liability reasons, his professor said no. But this didn't stop him. He decided to perform the surgery on himself. He tricked the nurse into thinking that he was going to perform the surgery on her, but instead he anesthetized his own arm and started to advance the catheter into his heart. The surgery was a success, but he was dismissed from his program for violating the rules. But then 17 years later, he actually won a Nobel Prize for physiology and medicine for his part in the invention of cardiac catheterization. A biopsy climbs onto this list next up at number 9. An American doctor named Jerry Nelson was hired to spend a year at a very secluded scientific research station, and this was located at the South Pole, where she would be the only doctor there. Well, during her time, she discovered a lump on her right breast, and after talking with other doctors in the States, she decided that it would be best to perform a biopsy on herself. So in case you didn't know, a biopsy is when you take a sample of a tissue from the body to examine it more closely. Well, the material that she had on site was too outdated, so the results were inconclusive. So a military plane dropped off new supplies, so she performed the biopsy again, and this time it showed her that she had cancer. So what did she do? Well, she administered her own chemotherapy, and once she was back in the United States, after multiple surgeries and complications, she finally went into remission. Up next, number 8, we have kidney stones. A military surgeon found himself in a lot of pain when he was diagnosed with kidney stones. By the time he turned 27 years old, he had already been under the knife about 5 times to try to remove it. Some of those botched surgeries will cause him to have long-lasting complications. Well, years later, he decided that he was going to remove the 6th stone himself. Using a mirror, he used the scars from the other surgeries as a guideline, and then he began cutting. He opened himself up, located his bladder, and found the 6th kidney stone. He was able to remove it, and the self-surgery was a success. But when his kidney stones came back years later, he decided that, it would be best if he didn't perform the surgery on himself. Instead, he opted for the non-invasive technique, and that's when they crush the stone and they remove it through a small hole. Well, you know what? That was probably a wise decision. DIY plastic surgery takes us all the way to number 7. A criminal named Tatsuya Itsuyashi was being convicted of murder and other brutal charges, but he evaded from being arrested for 2.5 years because he changed the way he looked through plastic surgery that he did on himself. Is this real life right now? He cut off his lower lip, he dug some moles off his cheek with a box cutter, and he used a needle and thread to alter his nose until it looked completely different. I think I would rather just go to prison than do this on myself. Oh, and a lot of these procedures were actually done in a public bathroom. I can only imagine how many infections he probably got. That's why he was unrecognizable. He was actually eventually caught when he tried to do more plastic surgeries. Well, he got caught because he went to a professional and they probably recognized him. I guess he should have just stuck with doing them himself. The removal of a musket ball brings us to number 6. During the Revolutionary War, women were not allowed to be enlisted in the army, but Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man. She changed her name to Robert Shirtliff, and then she enlisted herself in the Continental Army. She ended up getting injured while on the line of fire, and a musket ball lodged into her leg. She needed surgery, but was scared to go under the knife because they would find out that she's not a man, she's actually a woman. She'd get in a lot of trouble. So she did the next best thing. She performed the surgery on herself. Although the surgery was a success, it definitely wasn't professionally done, so she did suffer from permanent injuries. A doctor who removed his own appendix takes us to number 5. During an expedition to the Antarctic, a Russian surgeon became seriously ill. He needed to have his appendix taken out or else he would go into septic shock. And since he was the only doctor on the team, he realized that he wanted to live, he would have to perform the surgery on himself. So he came up with a detailed plan for how the operation would go and assigned people specific roles. He gave himself a local anesthetic, cut off his skin, and removed his appendix. I'd probably faint on the first little baby incision. I'd be like, ah! I mean, no one should ever see what their inside of their body looks like. Up next, number 4, we have an amputation on the right arm. Aaron Ralston made international headlines with his survival story. He was on a canyoneering trip alone when a heavy boulder fell and pinned his right forearm down. After spending 5 days trying to break free, he became so dehydrated and delirious, so he prepared to cut off his dying arm. He used a dull blade and some pliers to cut through the tendons and bones. He managed to break free, walk 8 miles, and rappel down a 65-foot cliff in order to get himself help. This definitely is one of the most intense survival stories I've ever heard of, and I'm not sure how many people would be able to do this in order to survive. Well, a lot of you guys probably know the story I'm talking about because it got turned into a Hollywood movie. Moving to number 3, we have an appendectomy and inguinal hernia repair. These surgeries sound super complicated, and you know what? They are. So I was shocked to find out that a doctor actually performed these surgeries on himself. Dr. Evan Kane was a chief surgeon at a hospital in New York City, and he wanted to prove to the world that general anesthesia was unnecessary for minor operations. So what did he do? Well, he used himself as a test subject and decided to remove his own appendix with only a local anesthetic. He propped himself up on the operating table and with the mirror over his abdomen, and also there were 3 other doctors there just in case, but he managed to remove his appendix all on his own. But the fun didn't stop there. When he was 70, he performed an even more complicated surgery on himself to fix a hernia. He would have easily killed himself, but he managed to perform it in under 2 hours without any complications. I mean, is there anything this man can't do? Trepanation brings us to number 2. For those of you guys who don't know, trepanation is when a hole is surgically drilled or scraped into the skull. So you might be surprised to find out that a person who performed trepanation on herself isn't even a doctor. Back in the 80s, Amanda Fielding wanted surgeons to do this procedure on her skull to apparently improve the quality of her brain. Well, since it wasn't a medically necessary procedure, she was shut down and Amanda decided to do it on herself. She took some anesthesia and used a dentist's drill to put a hole in her own skull. This just seemed like a recipe for disaster. Neurosurgeons spent a ton of time in medical school, but apparently Amanda thinks she can do it on herself by reading a WikiHow article. She lost a liter of blood, but she felt better after the procedure. But I'm gonna argue that her mental health is not okay. She definitely needs to reevaluate her life decisions. Topping your list at number 1, we have a C-section. This operation took place back in March of 2000 in a remote Mexican village. Access to healthcare was basically non-existent, and this mother knew exactly what needed to be done. After hours of unproductive labor, she was scared that she was gonna lose her baby. So she drank these strong alcoholic beverages, took her kitchen knife, and began to cut her stomach open. The procedure took 1 hour and she was able to deliver her own baby. One of her other kids ran to grab a nurse who repositioned her intestines, and then they sewed up her incision. She eventually made it to the nearest hospital that was 8 hours away. Is this real life right now? And even though she needed a lot of treatment, she was released 10 days later. So this woman did what she had to do, and I bet she has no regrets.